Welcome to Gravitas Studios, Behind the Boarding Pass podcast.
There is a moment in every journey where responsibility becomes visible. A moment when the abstractions of choice collapse into stark reality and the consequences of our actions stop being theoretical. It is the point where intentions meet the immovable wall of accountability, and every decision, small or large, reveals its weight. For some, this moment arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first morning light slipping through a crack in a shuttered window. For others, it is thunderous, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Today's story is about that moment. Today's story is a tale of responsibility, trust, and human error, set in the small but vibrant town of Muyuka, Cameroon. Bob lives in Muyuka, Cameroon, a town that hums with the rhythms of daily life. Market sellers calling out their wares, motorbikes zipping along narrow roads, children kicking improvised footballs through dusty streets. Bob didn't meet me randomly. He did not stumble across my number on a social media post, nor did he respond to an advertisement. No, Bob's path to me was indirect, yet profoundly telling. He had heard about me through a cousin of his, a cousin who had attended university with me at the University of Jiang. That detail matters more than one might think. In many parts of the world, trust is purchased through marketing or reputation. In ours, it is often inherited through association, passed hand to hand, story to story, like a fragile but reliable chain. If someone you know has walked a path successfully, their footsteps serve as a guide. When Bob reached out, his message was simple, unassuming. Since my cousin is already in the line, can I join too? A three-way call was scheduled. I, Bob, and his cousin, the chain of trust fully intact. Before any advice, any encouragement, or any expectations could be set, I asked Bob the standard questions I pose to every client, without exception. These are the questions that act as the first sieve of accountability, ensuring clarity before embarking on a process that, while promising, is also fraught with risk. How old are you? I asked. 30, he replied. What is your highest level of education? A bachelor's degree, he said confidently. Have you ever been to prison? No. Do you already have a passport? Yes, ready. Have you applied for admission or a visa to this country before? No, he answered. On paper, Bob was strong. There were no glaring red flags, no past refusals, no criminal history, nothing to suggest that the journey would be anything but straightforward. He was articulate, educated, and confident. The kind of candidate who, when he faced embassy officials, could represent himself effectively as a prospective student. We discussed the process carefully, step by step, milestone by milestone. We discussed expectations, obligations, and importantly, the risks inherent in international applications. Then, inevitably, we discussed money. I explained the fee structure clearly, a fraction up front, the rest contingent on achieving key milestones. Bob agreed without hesitation. One-fifth was paid immediately, signaling his commitment and activating the process. Admissions were initiated. To optimize Bob's chances, applications were submitted to two universities, each requiring a fee of €50. The meticulous compilation of his academic records, recommendation letters, and personal statements began. Weeks later, the first good news arrived. Bob was admitted into a 2-year master's program. The university, however, required a partial tuition payment before issuing the official admission letter. The sum requested, €1,500, was half of the total tuition. Bob made the payment. His place was secured. The admissions letter was issued. At this point, Bob was not alone in the process. He was part of a group of applicants, including his cousin, all navigating the same labyrinth of documentation, logistics, and deadlines. The next stage, documentation, is where many misunderstand the complexity of what a visa application truly demands. It is not a matter of simply filling out forms or providing a passport sized photo. For Bob, the list of required documentation was exhaustive. A sponsorship ID card, a bank statement covering 6 months of transactions, a bank attestation showing the current account balance, an affidavit of financial support, medical insurance, accommodation confirmation including first month rent of €200 paid, a caution deposit of €400 paid, a criminal record certificate, completed visa application forms. I list these not to boast, but to underline a fundamental truth. The upfront payment Bob made covered barely a fraction of what was spent on his behalf. The costs, both financial and temporal, far exceeded the initial deposit. Yet the process continued. Travel arrangements followed, from Muyuka to Kumba, from Cameroon to Abua, Nigeria, where the embassy was located. The journey was not just physical, it was emotional. The air buzzed with tension, gossip, and anticipation. Stories circulated among applicants and their families. Anxiety flared. Hope was fragile. At the embassy, interviews began. The process is always nerve-wracking. Each applicant faced a succinct interrogation of purpose, intent, and preparation. When Bob's turn arrived, reports were promising. He was fluent, confident, and articulate. He submitted all the documents in his possession. Everything seemed in order, but there was one problem. A single, crucial oversight that would soon determine the trajectory of his journey. Bob had not submitted his sponsor's bank statement. Later, he explained that the embassy had not requested it during the interview, that the 6 month transaction history and account balance were never mentioned. At the time, this seemed like a minor oversight, an inconsequential detail, but as the weeks passed, the gravity of the omission became painfully clear. Normally, after submission, applicants wait 6 to 8 weeks. By the fifth week, the embassy began contacting candidates with results. One by one, applicants received positive news. The group chat, a lifeline of shared experience, exploded with celebrations, congratulations, and relief. Everyone was rejoicing, everyone except Bob. Bob received no call, no confirmation, no instructions. Confused and anxious, he reached out privately. We began a meticulous review. Did you miss a call? I asked. No. Is your phone working? Yes. Then came the painful discovery. Bob still had the original copy of his sponsor's bank statement in his possession. It had never been submitted. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe to Gravitas Studios Behind the Boarding Pass. Hit the notification bell and be the first to catch our newest stories. Share, like, and drop your comments. Your voice is part of the journey. I was furious, not at Bob personally, but at the preventable nature of the refusal. The failure was avoidable. Everything else had been meticulously managed, admissions secured, payments made, forms completed, but one document, forgotten or ignored, rendered all prior efforts moot. Still, I urged him to travel with the group to Abuja, hoping against hope that something could be salvaged, but the embassy's decision was immutable. A refusal letter was issued, citing failure to provide proof of financial sponsorship. Without evidence that he could sustain himself, the embassy concluded that Bob could not succeed as a student. Appeals were filed, explanations submitted, but nothing changed. While others returned home with visas in hand, Bob returned empty-handed. And here is where the story takes its darker turn. This is where disappointment metamorphoses into anger and accountability becomes contested territory. Bob demanded a refund, not a request, not a conversation, a demand. He accused me of favoritism, of providing better documents to people I knew, to family, to those I supposedly preferred. He said I must refund the 1/5 he deposited. And then came the insults, the threats. He spoke of juju, curses, and even death. At that moment, the issue was no longer financial. It was about accountability, about the limits of responsibility, and the boundaries between agent and applicant. Pause for a moment. Let us consider the costs incurred on Bob's behalf. university application fees, tuition deposit, accommodation payments, documentation expenses, logistics and travel, time invested. All these resources were spent in good faith, based on Bob's compliance and commitment. The refusal had nothing to do with counterfeit documents, laziness, or favoritism. It was caused entirely by the failure to submit one critical document, the document he already possessed. And yet, Bob demanded compensation as if the system had failed him. This raises profound questions. Where does responsibility truly begin? And where does it end? Is an agent responsible for documents that a client refuses to submit? Does disappointment grant someone the moral right to threaten and coerce? Must failure always be someone else's fault? This episode is not about humiliation, it is about boundaries, systems, especially ones as delicate as international admissions and visa applications, cannot operate if agents absorb every mistake made by clients. Without accountability, education loses its meaning and the structures built to ensure fairness and rigor collapse. Bob's story is a cautionary tale. It teaches that responsibility is visible not when things go right, but when they go wrong. That the human tendency to assign blame must be tempered by the recognition of personal agency. That trust, while necessary, is not a substitute for diligence. I leave the matter unresolved, not because I lack opinion, but because the story itself is the lesson. In the comment section of your own reflections, ask yourself, should Bob be refunded? If so, under what principles? How can such a situation be addressed with dignity and empathy without undermining accountability? Where does the responsibility of the agent end and the responsibility of the applicant begin? Behind every visa refusal, there is a human decision, a human judgment, and behind every demand for a refund, there is a human story that must be examined honestly, without bias, without anger, without shortcuts. Because in moments like these, responsibility becomes visible. Choices are no longer abstract. Consequences are no longer theoretical. Bob wanted a refund, but the truth is, the lesson is far more important than the money. It is about boundaries, about accountability, about understanding the weight of one's actions and the shared responsibility in every human endeavor. And that ultimately is why Bob's story matters. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe to Gravitas Studios. Behind the boarding pass, hit the notification bell and be the first to catch our newest stories. Share, like, and drop your comments. Your voice is part of the journey.